Buenos dias. We're going to a Latino country, or a Latina country if you prefer. And in those countries, Buenos dias is part of the daily routine. It's a nice way to meet somebody, isn't it? It's easy too. Good day. And if it's not good day, it's Buenas tardes, which is the afternoon. Good afternoon. And that's part of Latino culture, and I know that we're going to find that down there in Costa Rica. It's a nice way to start off the day. Speaking of Latino countries, I have a lot of experience in Mexico that I've mentioned. And one of the things that I like to tell my students in terms of a story about Mexico that really blows open doors when you think about how we normally operate in the US is there's a book that I read called On Mexican Time. This book basically parodies an American expatriate, somebody who's moved to Mexico in this place called San Miguel de Allende. It's just in the north of Mexico City, and there's a lot of Americans that have moved there, and it's a very artistic community. And he was watching the town, and he was watching this general store as he started to take up living in this town, and the general store was owned by a woman. It was a generally owned store, owned by a shopkeeper, but it offered general store products, so one of everything, which is very important in Mexican villages. Not a Wawa, but a kind of a hardware type mom and pop store. And he noticed that she got a new product in one time, which was a colander to drain vegetables. And this colander sold out right away. And he noticed it never came back in stock. So he asked her, he said, "What happened to the colander?" She said, "Oh, that was too much trouble. It kept selling out, so I got rid of it." And that's just mind-blowing to us as Americans. We're capitalists, right? We cannot perceive of ever turning down a product selling too much. We would only see that as a sign of success and a sign that we need to capitalize on further. And so that's my way of introducing our subject matter for today. It's not going to be easy for many of you. It is a Marxist analysis. It's our first chapter in the book, really, where we're going to start applying media criticism perspectives to media content. That's going to be your task today in your question response, as a matter of fact. But Marxist analysis does not come easy to us because we've grown up in a fairly ideologically driven culture when it comes to thinking about economic systems, and capitalism is something that most people are not only sold on, to use a capitalistic metaphor, but also we don't really have alternate ways of looking at capitalism because we're growing up in a culture that embraces it and excludes other ways of thinking like Marxism, which is not to be equated with communism, and it's not to be equated with socialism either, although both of those movements, both of those economic systems have embraced Marxist theory as their foundation for how they've developed what their policies are. But today we're approaching Marxism, and the way that it's approached normally in academia, we're approaching Marxism as a theoretical perspective for analyzing media. And so we're going to take a look at Marxist theory here, and this is a chapter where I am going to spend more time than I normally would with other chapters because of the lack of knowledge about Marxism. I have to do some basic building blocks, but understand that in the future chapters, I'm not going to be summarizing them in quite as much detail. But for today, I'm going to, in this instructor video, Marxism is both a political movement. It's a movement to try and cause change. You can see some of that in Bernie Sanders' speech, for example. It has to do with trying to get more equality in culture and not have people that are so advantageously rich versus those that are poor. So it's both a political movement, but it is also a social theory. It's a theory about how society is organized. I'm going to try and demonstrate that shortly for you. Marxism comes from the author Karl Marx. He was a German, and he did partner with somebody else who wrote the famous book Das Kapital, the Capital. His partner was Friedrich Engels, who was actually English. Engels doesn't get a lot of credit. It's mostly Karl Marx, who is credited for this theory, which then has been adopted by political movements and even into government. So what is the premise? The premise of Marxism is that the mode of production in society, the way that things are produced and the way that ideas are produced, because both can be produced, the mode, the means by which they are produced, which is the underlying economic structure, you have to take a look at it. It's not easy to see. You have to figure out what that underlying economic structure is. That determines the social relations of the production. Now, that last part is probably the confusing part, that the mode of production determines the social relations of production. What I'm saying is it's the relations between human beings and each other, and between human beings and that production process. If you can hold that thought for a moment, that's what social relations are: relations between each other and the relations between human beings and the production process. So as a quick example, you go to a restaurant and you're going to be served by a server, and you want that server as another human being to be nice to you. But in our model, the capitalist model, also known as the capital accumulation model, in the capitalist model, we pay for that smile. We pay for that extra quick step when they bring their food out. We pay for them checking in on our table. We do that through the tip. That's expected. That's a capital accumulation model. It's capitalism. It organizes our social relations. If we do not tip, then the waiter or the waitress, the server, may be likely to not be nice to us the next time. It's a direct relation. Now you may say, oh, of course they need the tips, and that's not the point. The point is the underlying economic structure there is organizing our social relations in that way, and that's what Marx is saying. One of the key terms of Marxism is historical materialism. Historical materialism, which refers to how the character of our social life is a reflection of our material conditions. Now, when we say material, we're not necessarily meaning material objects, though that is the key component of materialism. It has to do with how those objects are produced and who owns those objects, and the relations between human beings as a result of that process. So when you look at the mode of production, what Marx is often looking at is who is producing the media, or rather, I should say, people who apply Marxism are looking at that, because Marx didn't spend a lot of his time analyzing specifically media. That's his theory has been generated into academic settings, and there's an enormous body of literature basing his theory on critiquing media, and when they're looking at the modes of production, they're looking at who owns the media production companies, and is there fairness there, and are those media production companies holding a kind of power that is excluding certain voices from being heard, metaphorically speaking. That's how I want you to think of Marxism. That's about the relations between us and the material production, the production of materials. One of the other key terms to Marxism is social consciousness. It's social consciousness, which is expressed in your awareness. That's what a consciousness is, right? How aware are you of your conditions? How aware are you that you have a relationship with a server when you go to a restaurant that is going to be entirely dependent on the exchange of currency, or not entirely dependent, but very much dependent. So Marxism says that you have to acquaint yourself, more than acquaint yourself, you have to really study religion and politics and government and education and law and art, also known in Marx lexicon and Marx language as the superstructure. The superstructure. All of these things have to be studied to understand the material conditions of the base. So you have the superstructure, all those things have to be studied. You have to have wide knowledge to understand the base, the economic system that is running underneath us, which in the United States is capitalism. In other countries, the Soviet Union, it's a form of communism. It's communism and capitalism, just like China. China's communism and capitalism. Sweden is socialism. Venezuela calls itself socialism, but it's not really socialism according to socialism theorists. And so you have all these underlying base economic systems, and that's what we're starting to study in this chapter as it relates to media. So we're going to look at the forces of production. And to produce media, to produce a web page, requires you to have a computer, which is made up of parts that you're pulling out of many countries that you wouldn't even know exist in the chain of supply for computer products, like Nigeria and Congo, where a lot of the minerals that are used in screens as well as your cell phones, that has to be pulled out of the ground. So modes of production do involve manufacturing, even though we're talking about electronic media. You have to have that on your mind when you're talking about Marxist theory. And then you also have to think about the relations of production. And the relations of production are the labor practices and the ownership. So you have owners, they're bosses, they report to stockholders. Those people have voting rights. But then you have the people who are actually making the television sets, who are actually reporting on the news, who are actually directing television news production newscasts. In other words, you have the people who are doing the work, then you have managers, then you have owners, you have general managers, you have board of directors. That's what Marx takes a look at, the relations between all those people, the relations between the leverage that owners have over employees when it comes to the wages that they can give, and how much do employees put up with because they're afraid that they might be fired or they won't have a chance at getting a raise in wages. This is all part of Marxism. It's looking at that economic underlying base through the superstructure of looking at law, politics, economics, etc. Obviously, we don't have time to do that in a single class, let alone an entire semester. And so you're really just getting the very entry point to Marxism in this chapter. So now let's move on to capitalism itself. Capitalism, we often don't study it. We just assume it's a good thing. We take it for granted. It gets more criticism in the college setting. In the college, we're all about alternative ideas. So let's consider any and all ideas. That's what we're about, free space for thinking. So capitalism does get put under the microscope here. And it's basically driven by the desire to increase capital. That's what capitalism is, the desire to increase capital. Capital is not just money, it's wealth. It's money made up, it's wealth made up of money and investments and assets. So it can be land, it can be a house, it can be copyright for a song, it can be all of these things, and it can be cash, and it can be gold, and it can be bitcoins, and it can be the currency that you play video games with, skins. It can be any of that. It's building up wealth. That's what it's all about. And so there's a profit motive in capitalism. That profit motive is always there to sell things. Contemporary Marxists, people who have taken up Marxism but who are thinking in today's climate, they like to investigate how patterns of ownership amongst the media and the profit motive, those two things together, the people who own media and the profit motive as the economic system, how they affect the business practices and then ultimately the content that you get from media. So that's what we're looking at here. And let's face it, as the book points out, the average American spends more than $1,000 a year on media content. We're big consumers. We go to a lot of movies. We buy a lot of gadgets. Well, that's not even speaking of gadgets. We pay a lot for streaming services. We like to absorb media. So now you can study the rest of the chapter in more detail yourself. You can look at advertising and you can find out how advertising fits in with capitalism, how it's a necessary component, but let's not just take it for granted. It has certain effects on the media content. You can read about that in the chapter. You can look at how certain companies that own media products, you're going to be studying one of them in your question response today, how certain companies use advertising in a certain way that then has an impact not only on the media content, but also on our level of knowledge and the way that we can think and believe as a result of the media content that we're accessing. So now Marxism is starting to get deeper. That's why you have to look at that superstructure, which it does involve law, it does involve politics, it involves a lot of things. Next up, you're going to be taking a look at patterns of media ownership in this class. You're going to be taking a look at patterns of media ownership in this chapter, and you'll see that there are various forms of ownership. You know, we are flying on American Airlines. American Airlines is only one of a handful of airlines that is going to take us down to Costa Rica. What does that do to the price? What does that do to the schedule that we have to fly on? Like, we could not take a plane at 9 a.m. if we wanted to. There wasn't one. It's only one at 4 p.m. What is it about the ownership pattern, as you read through this chapter, that American Airlines embodies as one of just a handful of airlines? And then once we get in the airport, if you want to buy anything, you are stuck with what is offered. What kind of ownership pattern is that? I think you know what I mean. It begins with an M and ends with a poli. Okay, you got that one, right? So now you can start to take a look at a sample, a media sample, which is what you're going to be doing in your question response today. And what you're going to be able to do is you're going to be able to figure out strategies for profit maximization, which probably you already have an instinctive feel for anyhow. This is the next section of the chapter, strategies for maximizing that profit, getting the absolute most. You know, like when you go into a store and you come out with a bunch of coupons and you think, oh, you know, I did need that. And you go right back in the store and purchase something like CVS. And it's very common. How can they take advantage of even somebody who's buying something to get them to purchase even more with every last detail? And oh, by the way, can we have your email? And then we're going to text you, we're going to send you an email and your phone number, which your account is under for your frequent purchases, and then we're going to text you with specials. And it's just, that's maximization in action in the pharmaceutical industry. Can you imagine what it's like in the media industry to maximize your attention? Coronavirus, great example. Great example. Coronavirus is a great way for media to maximize attention on CNN and all these other channels that are carrying this news story. So when you read this chapter, think about that and how media work, how media are using these strategies, because media are money makers. That's what they're doing. That's why they're selling advertising. They want to be able to charge the most possible money they can for an ad so that they can feed back into the capital accumulation model, accumulate a capital, become a wealthy media organization. That's what that model is all about. That's what Marxism tries to take a look at. And that's why at the end of the chapter, you do get consequences of ownership patterns. You get consequences. You're going to study ownership patterns in your chapter summary here, and then you're going to read about how there are consequences which you may not have been aware of, and actually consequences of which you may have to travel to another country like Costa Rica to see firsthand when you really truly break away from the culture that you've grown up in and see how another culture does have a different superstructure, does have a different base, does have a different relationship. Our servers in Mexico, are we going to be expecting the same things out of them? Are they going to be expecting the same things out of us? Because the means of production, the means of producing their labor so that we pay for it with a tip, is that somehow different in Costa Rica? That's what we're going to take a look at. Ultimately, Marx, we're going to be going to a little bit later in the book, because we get towards the end, we bring all these perspectives together. Marx is working towards the workers get to own the means of production, not the owners, not the Disneys and the Fox corporations and news corporations. Sorry, news corporation is Fox. The NBC Universal corporations, not those people, but the news editors, the producers, the reporters. They get to own the means of. They own the equipment, the machinery, and they are also producing. That's what Marxism is arguing for, because of the consequences, which you'll read about in the chapter and explore in your question response today. So that'll leave things for today. Have a great day. Adios.